Hey everybody, Matt from 90th percentile.ca here. For access to more study notes, practice questions, mock exams, and end of chapter question videos, visit 90th percentile.ca and sign up for your free trial today. Link below in the description. This learning module is the firm and market structures. There aren't too many end of chapter questions in this module, so we'll go through it pretty quick. But for a high level overview of what we're going to talk about, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into perfect competition, which we're already familiar with at this point, and then we're also going to be introduced to three new forms of imperfect competition, which are monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies, with, of course, the competitiveness of each market getting lower and lower as we move down the spectrum, with the extreme being a monopoly with only one firm supplying a product or service. So within all of these different types of market structures, we're going to talk about their characteristics, how they determine their pricing strategy, what equilibrium looks like in each of these markets, and at the very end, we'll calculate a couple metrics which we use to determine the concentration or competitiveness in each type of these industries. So with that, let's get into the questions. Here we have a question that's asking us about the different types of market structures. Before we go into the actual questions, just want to bring your attention to this table that I took from my notes, which gives a quick summary of the key things that you need to know regarding the different types of market structures. So we have perfect competition as the very first row, and then the three types of imperfect competition. It's kind of a bucket term used to describe monopolistic competition, oligopolies, and monopolies. So if you go column to column, perfect competition, we're already familiar with it. There's a bunch of different sellers. Pretty homogeneous means that they're selling the same product pretty much. Very low barriers to entry. The firm doesn't have any pricing power. They take the market prices given, and similarly, they have no non-price competition. So any way that they compete with others outside of price. An example of perfect competition I like to use is farming. So if you think of farmers of corn, the market price is the market price, and like corn is corn. It's all pretty much the same thing. So that's probably closest example I can think of related to perfect competition. Monopolistic competition down here, somewhat similar to perfect competition in that we have many sellers. Here we're actually selling slightly different products. So we have differentiated products, not the same. Barriers to entry are still pretty low, and there's some pricing power. And then in terms of competing outside of price, we can do so through advertising, brand awareness, and differentiating your products. Example I like to use for monopolistic competition is a bunch of those suppliers of gym supplements. Like there's a bunch in the market now. Like in my opinion, all the supplements are pretty much the same, but they are slightly differentiated, and there's a lot of brand awareness associated with selling each type of supplement. So these are pretty similar. Only difference is the slightly differentiated products leads to some pricing power. And in an oligopoly, we have a couple sellers, but they're selling similar products, and there's a high barrier to entry, and then the pricing power is more on the higher side compared to like the perfect competition, monopolistic competition that we've seen. And then once again, they can advertise, get brand awareness, and differentiate their products to compete outside of price. Example I like to use for oligopolies. Mentioned it earlier about the Canadian telecom market, but there's basically like three telecom providers. They sell the same product, like it's cell phones and cell phone data. Barriers to entry are very high because it's tough to like build your own wireless network throughout Canada, especially given how big it is. And they pretty much have all the pricing power. I mean, we're paying like $100 a month for standard like talk and text and data. So kind of a ripoff. It's a huge scam, but that's the example for oligopoly. And then a monopoly is, of course, the extreme side where there's one seller, they have a unique product, very high barriers to entry. They can pretty much set the price, and advertising is their main way to get more sales outside of reducing prices. With that, we can go back to the questions here. Number one, a market structure characterized by many sellers with each having some pricing power and product differentiation is best described as, let's going to be monopolistic competition. Right away, quick note, as soon as you see many sellers, it's automatically not an oligopoly or monopoly. 2, a market structure with relatively few sellers of a homogeneous or standardized product is best described as. You could actually like stop the sentence right here where it says a few sellers, and you know it's going to be an oligopoly, which is pretty much a monopoly but with just like 2 or 3 or 4 firms. The demand schedule in a perfectly competitive market is given by P equals 93 minus 1.5Q. So this is the price depending on the quantity demanded for Q less than or equal to 62. And the long run cost structure of each company is, we have total cost, average cost, and marginal cost. New companies will enter the market at any price greater than what? So we have two graphs down here. This one is the short run equilibrium for a perfectly competitive market. And you can see that we always produce where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which is point A right here. And this tiny little gap from the marginal revenue to the average cost is the firm's profit. And then in the long run up here, the whole idea, once again, is that a bunch of firms enter the market such that profit is essentially reduced to zero. And here we have basically the exact same chart as down below. Like we have a long run marginal cost curve here, but same concept. Only difference is that we have the price decreased here to 450 from 571 in the short term. And due to this, we have marginal revenue, which is price, being equal to average cost, and there's effectively zero profit for all the firms. So the firms enter the market, they drive down the price, and basically no one earns an economic profit. You can kind of see this chart up here visually if you were to draw a line like right here at, call it 450, and it's, looks like the exact same thing in the long run. So the whole idea is that a bunch of firms enter the market and drive down the price. So where here from this question are firms going to enter the market? Well, the price is going to have to be slightly greater than this, right? Such that more firms are going to enter the market and they're going to drive down the cost again, and everything kind of shifts. The long run marginal cost curve shifts to the right, and it's going to be an equilibrium again. So to solve for this, we have average cost and marginal cost, and we need to set those two equal, because in the long run equilibrium, marginal revenue is equal to average cost. So if we set these two equations equal, we can solve for Q. So 256 over Q is average cost plus 2 plus 4Q equals 2 plus 8Q. So if I was to bring all this over, bring over the 4Q, we get 8Q minus 4Q is 4Q. Bring over this 2, and 2 cancel out if you bring this one over. This is 2 minus 2. And then we have what, 256 over Q. So it's basically going to be 4Q squared equals 56. And if you were to solve for this, you would get a Q of 66. Sorry, 8. And from there, now that we have the Q, we can come up top and solve for P just by subbing in Q to this equation. So get P equals 93 minus 1.5 Q. Q is 8. So 93 minus 1.5 times 8, and we get 66, which is our answer in B. And so at any price greater than 66, of course, this is, the numbers are different. This is just an example, but at any price greater than 66, like if this was 66 in the equilibrium, more firms would enter the market because there's a little bit of profit, and then over time, that profit would be reduced to zero. A company doing business in a monopolistically competitive market will most likely maximize profits when its output quantity is set such that average cost is minimized, marginal revenue equals average cost, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They always produce, guys. Always, always, always optimal quantities, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This is the same for perfect competition. It's the same for monopolistic competition, and it's the same for monopolies. It's slightly different for oligopolies, and we'll get into that in a bit, but the optimal quantity is always, always, always marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So just get that nailed in your head. Pricing strategy in an oligopoly most likely results in a demand curve that is kinked, vertical, or horizontal. So I have a couple images here to help us. I have this chart and then this table, which I took from my notes. We'll go with the pricing strategy first. It's a quick summary of how firms decide on their price and their quantity to produce, depending on what type of market they're in. So like I said before, perfect competition, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Monopolistic competition, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And monopoly is the same as monopolistic competition. But in an oligopoly, it depends on how other firms are expected to react. So we have this chart here, which kind of describes how demand differs based on pricing strategy for an oligopoly. And the whole idea around the oligopoly is that if one firm increases prices, the other firm does not match the price increase. But if one firm decreases their price, this will be matched. And the way I like to think of this is if you think of two gas stations on the opposite side of the street, if one gas station increases their prices, the other one's not going to care and they're just going to leave their price as is, and more people are likely to go there. Versus if one gas station decreases their prices, then the other one's going to decrease their price as well. So we can kind of see that through this kinked demand curve. So we have DP up, which is demand for a price increase, and then DP down, which is demand for price decrease. If one of the firms increases their prices, you can see that demand starts to, quantity demanded starts to move to the left or decrease. Whereas if they decrease their price to like somewhere over here, you can see how much more is demanded, right? It's a big shift in the quantity demanded. So to summarize really quick, the pricing strategy on an oligopoly depends on what their competition does. And because of this dependence, we don't have a officially an officially established demand curve. It kind of kinks like this because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. So due to that, we're going to have a kinked demand curve. Deep River Manufacturing is one of many companies in an industry that make a food product. Deep River units are identical up to the point they are labeled. So there's some sort of brand recognition or advertising in this market. Deep River produces its labeled brand, which sells for $2.20 per unit, and house brands for 7 different grocery chains, which sell for $2 per unit, which is like a, I guess, no-name brand. Each grocery chain sells both the Deep River brand and its house brand. The best characterization of Deep River's market is an oligopoly, perfect competition, or monopolistic competition. Can't be perfect competition because we have some sort of branding or advertising, because we have like, you know, the same product, but it's selling for $2.20 just because of the label versus $2. It's not going to be an oligopoly because we don't really have anything about competitor behavior, and it also seems that it's, you know, pretty low barriers to entry, so we're going to scratch out that, and it's going to be monopolistic competition due to the fact that they're one of many companies also, so it's probably not an oligopoly, so many companies, and there's some sort of brand awareness. Here we have a game theory question related to Nash equilibrium in oligopolies. So we have Sigmasoft and Theta Tech, and they're the dominant makers of computer system software. Market has two components, so a large mass market component in which demand is price sensitive and a smaller performance oriented component. Doesn't really matter. Sigmasoft's product is considered to be technically superior. Okay. Each company can choose one of the two strategies. open architecture or proprietary. The descriptions don't really matter for the purpose of this question. The whole point of what we're trying to do here is we have this matrix, which is similar to what you would see in Prisoner's Dilemma. So it's kind of a game theory concept where two parties, or in this case, two firms, two competitors, make their decision while considering what the decision of the other firm will be. So given the decision of somebody else, what would be your best decision? So in this little matrix here, we have the different companies, Sigmasoft, and then either open, or proprietary. So there are two decisions they can make. And then we have the circle or of the values in here, which are their profits, depending on which strategy they choose. So the whole idea around Nash equilibrium is that in equilibrium, either firm is not better off by changing their decision. So in order to figure out where the equilibrium is here, the trick is to first find a company that is better off no matter what the other company does given their decision. So if we look at this matrix here, we can start with like Sigmasoft choosing open. So we have 400 in this case, or 800 in this case. So if Sigmasoft is open and Theta Tech is open, Sigma gets 400. If Sigma is open and Theta is proprietary, Sigma gets 800. Whereas if Sigma is proprietary and Sigma is proprietary, they get 650 and then 600. So here there's actually a range of values. You can see the 400 is below the 600 and the 650 if it's proprietary. So if Sigma chooses open, it's not necessarily better off, because like if Sigma is open and then Theta is prop, then it's better off. But in this case, if they're both open, Sigma is the worst off it could possibly be. So this Sigma doesn't really have a decision where they're better off no matter what, right? Because here they could do 650, 600. This is one decision, and then 400 versus 800. So they would be better off here than these two. So Sigma's kind of all over the place, right? Like their values are too widespread to come up with a place where they're better off no matter what. So then I would move on to Theta Tech. And Theta Tech, you can see if they're proprietary, it's 300 and 400. Versus if they're open, they're better off in both cases, right? 600 is better than 300, 700 is better than 400. And the 600 is greater than even their best case in proprietary, right? So Theta is better off no matter what the competitor does if they're open. So given that Theta is open, what is Sigma's better decision? So we have Theta open here, Theta open here. So Sigma is going to choose not to be open because they're only going to get 400. They're going to choose 650. So Sigma is going to be proprietary and Theta Tech is going to be open. And that is your equilibrium, which is answer C down here. So proprietary for Sigma and open for Theta. Over time, the market share of the dominant company in an oligopoly will most likely increase, decrease, or remain the same. So this is something that we've touched on a couple times. In the long run, if there's any profits in the market, it's assumed that it attracts more firms into the market such that profits go to zero. And as a result of more firms entering the market, then the market share of existing competitors is going to decrease. And then in 14, market competitors are least likely to use advertising as a tool of differentiation in an industry structure identified as monopoly, perfect competition, monopolistic competition. Once again, we kind of touched on this earlier. In perfect competition, they're selling the exact same products. You won't see like a farmer of corn start advertising because their products are exactly the same. So your answer is going to be B. Here we have a natural gas company that's a monopoly, enjoying very high barriers to entry. Marginal cost is 40 bucks, average cost 70, and the price elasticity of demand for its product is 1.5. So 40, 70, 1.5. The company will most likely set its price at which price. So here I have another chart which shows marginal revenue, so this line over here, marginal cost, this curve line, and average cost right here. And this is for a monopoly, right? So key difference between the monopoly and perfect competition is that a monopoly can actually set its price. It doesn't take its price as given. But similarly to perfect competition and monopolistic competition, they're always going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost at this quantity. But then the price is going to be somewhere up here, such that they have the profit here in between the price and the average cost. So given that we know they're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, we have marginal cost here. And then we have another formula for marginal revenue, which was kind of buried in the last learning module. But do note that whenever you're given marginal revenue, or you're asked to determine marginal revenue and you have price elasticity of demand, you can determine it using this formula. So marginal revenue equals price times 1 minus 1 over price elasticity. So now that we have this formula and the marginal cost, we can set those equal to each other. So here marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and 40 is equal to this formula. So P times 1 minus 1 over price elasticity. And we can sub all this in. 40 equals P 1 minus 1 over 1.5. Can do some algebra here. 40 equals P, just multiplying this out, minus P over 1.5. And then if we were to run this out and solve for P, we would get a price of 120. And that's our answer, C. An analyst gathers the following market share data for an industry. So we have 6 companies and all of their sales. And we're asked to calculate the 4-company concentration ratio. All this is calculating the market share of the 4 largest firms combined. So pretty simple math here. We do 300 plus 250 plus 200 plus 150 equals 900. And we would divide this by 900 plus the remaining 2. So 900 over 900 plus 100 plus 150, which is 900 over 1050, which is 86%. B. So wrapping up here, we have an analyst gathering the following market share data for an industry comprised of 5 companies. 5 companies and their market share. The industry's 3-firm, I'm going to butcher this, Herfindahl-Hirschman index is closest to. So the acronym is just HHI. That's how most people remember it. But all this, this is another metric used to determine competitiveness or how concentrated an industry is, similar to the concentration ratio we just looked at. But this one's a little bit different in that we just take, in this case, top 3 firms, take their market share, so 0.35 plus 0.25 plus 0.2, and we square each of them, and then sum them up. And if we were to run this, we would get 0.225. So our answer is B. Really quickly, the difference between the HHI and the N-firm concentration ratio. I have another example here that I can use to kind of demonstrate, but the short answer is that the HHI accounts for the relative size of the firms just by squaring these values. Because if you look at this example here, we have industry A, industry B, 4 firms and their respective market shares. The concentration ratio, so if I just summed all these up for the top 4 firms, and both these would be 80%. But if I were to do the HHI for A, it's going to be 0.2 squared and then times 4, right? Because all of them are the same, which would be 0.16 versus the HHI for B is the 0.35 squared plus 0.25 squared plus 0.1 squared plus 0.1 squared, which is actually around 0.2, which is higher. And you can see that this, the HHI in B versus A, indicates that B is a more competitive industry, which is true because you can see that it's more concentrated around the top, where the top two firms dominating most of the market. So anything with an HHI over 0.18 is typically the benchmark that they use, and anything over this is uncompetitive. And if it's 1.0, obviously it's just one firm, so that's a monopoly.